Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing discussion of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. In the previous lecture, we concluded by talking about the historic election of 1912, which ended with the election of Woodrow Wilson. In this lecture, we'll begin talking a little bit more about Woodrow Wilson, the last president of the Progressive Era. In the previous lecture, I mentioned Wilson's platform in the 1912 election, which called for a new freedom, supporting small farmers and small businessmen against the powers of big business and industry. As president, Wilson put this platform into effect, attacking what he called the triple wall of privilege: banks, trusts, and the tariff. Tariffs, in Wilson's view, protected big business at the expense of individual consumers and particularly small farmers. In 1913, Wilson signed the Underwood-Simmons Act into law, reducing tariff rates around the country. He also signed the Federal Reserve Act, which made the nation's currency more flexible and would help small farmers, businessmen, and entrepreneurs against banks and entrenched industry. I mentioned in a previous lecture that while Roosevelt was known as the trust buster, Woodrow Wilson did far more than Roosevelt had done in terms of attacking the monopolies and trusts. He did this through the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914, which specified what kinds of business tactics were illegal. It also recognized labor unions and exempted them from being tried by the Clayton Antitrust Act. We will talk more about Wilson and his presidency in future lectures and on a variety of different issues during this period. But it's within only a couple of years of becoming president that Wilson has to turn his attentions to World War I, which breaks out in Europe, and then his obsession becomes international affairs. Again, we'll talk about those issues in future lectures. So the early 20th century was shaped by these two giants in the White House, Roosevelt and Wilson. And at first glance, they appear very different. Roosevelt was robust, energetic, and bombastic. Wilson reminds us more of a high school principal. And in fact, he was the president of Princeton University at one time. They have been called by one historian, John Milton Cooper, the warrior and the priest, two very different personalities. And yet, they had much in common as well. They had both overcome childhood challenges, asthma for Teddy Roosevelt and dyslexia for Wilson. Both lost their wives to premature death. Both were prolific writers well before becoming president. And both came into the White House from non-traditional perspectives. Teddy Roosevelt as the so-called Rough Rider, and Wilson as the academic. Both supported the new American imperialist adventure, which we've talked about previously and we'll talk about more going forward. And both supported American government action in support of the public need, so-called progressivism. And so these two presidents, while different in many ways, both helped to forge a new path for the nation and for the office of the presidency. They were both instrumental in shaping the growing role of the federal government in American life and in the economy. If Teddy Roosevelt is known as the trust buster, and in many ways he did start momentum for that idea, it was under Woodrow Wilson that federal regulation of big business reached its full potential. Various federal laws, supported by Supreme Court decisions, strengthened the role of the federal government in overseeing and, when appropriate, reining in big business. Recall that prior to Teddy Roosevelt, the dominant ideology was laissez-faire economics, in which the government took a hands-off approach to business. While Teddy Roosevelt still believed that most large businesses were good and supporting the needs of the American public, Wilson took a much more aggressive approach in stepping in to control big business. It should be noted that one unforeseen outcome of the growing trend of government regulation was that labor unions also suffered. In fact, there were more cases pursued through the Clayton Antitrust Act against labor unions than against business monopolies, an issue that we'll talk more about going forward. Roosevelt and Wilson also both drove the United States into the new age in diplomacy, through the era of imperialism and through World War I, which we'll discuss in a future lecture. These men both also wrought changes in the vision of the presidency itself, the bully pulpit as it came to be known under Roosevelt. Prior to Roosevelt's presidency, the most prominent and powerful politicians in the country were often not the president himself. They might be senators, congressmen, secretaries of state, or Supreme Court justices. But after Teddy Roosevelt, the eyes of the nation would always be on the president. For Roosevelt, it was confidence and bombast. He encouraged Americans to do better and to be better, driving the nation forward by sheer force of will. Wilson similarly used his platform as president. However, he was the educator, the lecturer. He laid out his case with argument and reason, content to win over the people with intellectual magnetism. Both at times failed in their endeavors, and both sometimes miscalculated. The Progressive Era did not solve all the nation's problems. One glaring shortcoming is that it failed to speak adequately for minorities, especially African Americans. To some degree, the progressive impulse was rooted in ideas of social control and elitism. Progressives sought to improve the lives of the poor and needy, not so much out of sympathy for them, but to protect the middle and upper classes from crime and disease. And while things did improve for workers, for women, and for children in the Progressive Era, much work remained to be done. Many measures in terms of social welfare would have to wait another few decades until the New Deal of the 1930s and even the Civil Rights Movement of the 1950s and 60s. And in many ways, the plight of the masses still remains a major issue in the country even today. But we can say with certainty that after these two men, the nation and the presidency would never be the same. As we move forward into our last few lectures in this course, we'll examine some of those successes and shortcomings of the Progressive Era, beginning in the next series of lectures, talking about race in the country during the Progressive Era.